Welcome to On Books at the Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies. I'm Dinda, Elliott, the Executive Director, and today we're delighted to have Professor Susan Greenhalgh, who is the John King Wilma Cannon Fairbank Professor of Chinese Society Emerita at Harvard University. Professor Greenhalgh is known for her groundbreaking work on the one-child population policy, the rise of diet-related chronic diseases in the U.S. and China, and more generally the place of modern science in Chinese politics and policymaking about these issues. Professor Greenhalgh is the author of Just One Child, Science and Policy in Deng's China and Cultivating Global Citizens, Population in the Rise of China, co-author of Governing China's Population, From Leninist to Neoliberal Biopolitics, and co-editor of Can Science and Technology Save China, among other books. We're very, very excited that her most recent book, called Soda Science, Making the World Safe for Coca Cola, has just come out, and we're looking forward to talking with you about that today. So Professor Greenhalgh, let's first set the stage. The first half of your book talks about what Coca Cola did in the United States. So though we want to focus most of our talk on China, what they were doing there, I think we need to have an understanding of what was happening, how Coca Cola helped shape science around sugar, obesity, and soda in the United States.
Coca Cola had a secret weapon, which was a shadowy, highly secretive scientific nonprofit funded by the food industry, not just Coca Cola, but all the big food companies. This organization was set up several decades ago to solve precisely these problems, scientific problems encountered by the food industry. This organization is called ILSI, and no sooner did the obesity epidemic begin to rise in the mid-1990s than ILSI called together a group of CEOs of the large food companies. They held a private meeting to decide what to do about the obesity problem, because big food was being targeted by public health critics. And the CEOs said, no change at all to our food policy. The only thing we'll agree to is encouraging kids to exercise more. And so that became ILSI's and Coke's official solution to the problem of rapidly rising obesity.
So ILSI was basically a nonprofit, right?
It's
set up by big food.
Registered as a nonprofit, if you look closely. So it claims that it benefits the public. If you look closely, you'll see that it actually benefits industry, private industry.
So they basically made the case for, you don't need to worry about how much Coke or whatever sugary soda you're drinking. What you need to worry about is how much exercise you're getting, right?
And the mantra is eat and drink anything you want, just exercise it off.
So why did scientists first, before we moved to China, why did scientists here in the States go along with this?
Some scientists had no problem at all. There were so many benefits to working with ILSI. One is just visibility. What matters most to researchers is being publicly and visible in the academic world. Lots of resources for their own research, hobnobbing with corporate executives, a chance to make a real difference in the global obesity problem.
And what impact did all of this have in the U.S.?
It had a huge impact, and it's very hard to tease out. What I've been able to learn is the impact on popular culture around lifestyles. So the obesity epidemic first became publicly very visible in the late 1990s. In the early 2000s, the big banks told these large food companies that if they didn't do anything, then their profits were going to be seriously eroded by the obesity problem. Starting around 2002-03, all these big companies adopted the mantra of active, healthy lifestyles. That equates healthy with active, and they push this in any number of ways, stamping it on all their products. And then the scientists working with ILSI had the same mantra, which is when it comes to exercise, doesn't matter what you eat, when it comes to obesity, doesn't matter what you eat, just exercise.
But again, just before we move to China, in other words, what you have is the government is also going along, they're adopting their sort of dietary policies and paradigms and sort of what you should do to live a healthy life, right?
No, the government never adopted this line.
Okay.
No, this was just China policy. U.S. policy may well reflect it in certain ways. I haven't been able to tease that out. What I have been able to tease out is the effect on popular culture. Because once some scientists say it's all about exercise, then all these companies making different products, whether they're workout products, whether they're foods, in their marketing, they stress, buy this, buy a Peloton bike, and then you can lose weight.
Right.
So it became popular cultural norm. Everybody knows that exercise is associated with losing weight.
Okay.
Before we go to China, one really important point. It's critical to know that exercise is important for weight loss, but it's secondary to dietary restraint, keeping those calories down.
Got it. Okay, so let's move to China. So first, let's talk a little bit about the context. At that time, this was kind of the go-go years in China, right? And in the 1990s, the 2000s, when China was really eager to learn from the West, kind of whatever the West was doing was good, and we want to learn about it. Meanwhile, adopting Western science and, of course, Western economic approaches. So then onto the stage walks Coca Cola. So then what happens?
That's just such a great image that you created, because in fact, Coca Cola was the very first company allowed to do business in China when China opened up. With Deng's permission in 1978, Coke was on the ground before anybody else. And China was actually, the Chinese leaders were actually very excited because they saw Coca-Cola as a technical innovator and a company that Chinese companies could learn from. So one of Coke's vice presidents was the head of ILSI, this scientific organization that I mentioned. He was traveling in China as early as late 1978, scouting for a collaborator, a scientific collaborator. And he uncovered two really promising candidates, both surnamed Chen, and worked with them quietly over the next 15 years. And then after Tiananmen and after Deng Xiaoping did his southern tour, opening up, opening up the borders again to global markets. That's when a lot of new nonprofits were formed. So at that point, they formed an ILSI branch in China.
So before
ILSI was global.
Okay, so before you move on with the story of Coca-Cola, again, back to sort of setting the stage, at that point, is China also beginning to experience an obesity problem? I mean, what's happening in terms of health and diet, and how is that changing as China becomes more and more affluent?
As a matter of fact, obesity was rising starting in the 1980s, but nobody really recognized it. Only in the early 1990s, I talked to a number of child health specialists. They said in the early 90s, people were saying, what are those fat children doing on the streets of Beijing? This is China. We're a land of famine. Where are these kids coming from? And not surprisingly, these kids began emerging in public 5 years after the first fast food restaurant, KFC, set up in Beijing in 1987. So obesity began to rise. In the early 80s, it was low. Then every decade after, it rose about 10%. The proportion of adults who had obesity or overweight rose that rapidly. It wasn't until ILSI in the U.S. asked the ILSI branch in China to put obesity on their agenda in 1999 that ILSI in China did a lot of work to create the BMI cut points for obesity and for overweight, Chinese specific cut points. Only then did China take obesity as an official condition. That was like 2000 to 2003.
I see. So Chinese scientists were starting to really worry about the obesity problem. I mean, these are good scientists who are worrying about the obesity problem. Then did you have some scientists who are taking one approach and others who are part of the ILSI empire taking another approach, or how, was there a division in the scientific world, or what was happening?
Right. As we know, China works by consensus. So ideally there would be scientific consensus. But as you suspected, in this case, there wasn't. There was a group of Chinese public health specialists. They were trained in nutrition. They were working with a world-renowned nutritionist, public health expert, based at North Carolina named Barry Popkin. There was a group of them, a cluster. They worked together carefully starting in the late 1980s. So they had worked together for 10 years, producing at least 100 articles by the time that ILSI took over the obesity question. And ILSI explicitly kept the Americans out of its process. It sidelined those Chinese who had worked with him, and it never invited Popkin to any of its meetings. So they were in effect, and they were very concerned about the impact of junk food and sugary soda on people's weight.
So at that point, what's happening in terms of ILSI's relationship with the Chinese government? I mean, how did they have influence?
Exactly. Well, in China, unlike in the U.S. and Western democracies, science is essentially subordinate to the state. The two are so close. Theoretically, in the U.S., science is independent from the state. In China, it's subordinate. So what this Coke executive who chose a collaborator knew was that many scientists have strong connections to the state. And the head of ILSI China that he chose was a former high official in the Ministry of Health. And then she became an ILSI leader, the top leader of ILSI in China. So she had a dual role. She was deeply conflicted. But what it meant was that whatever policy advice she wanted to give, the government would accept it without question, because of the great guanxi between her and the officials, the current officials in the Ministry of Health.
Right. So is there something particular about the Chinese system that makes the bureaucracy vulnerable to influence from the corporate world, or is this just the way it works everywhere in the world?
I think that there are things that are systematically different about China that makes China susceptible to this kind of corporate influence from abroad. One is, as I mentioned, that science is subordinate to the state, and another is the role of guanxi, because this ILSI China leader had such great guanxi with the top officials in the Ministry of Health. She essentially made obesity policy for the first 10 years, and nobody questioned her. In fact, they welcomed her. They essentially outsourced obesity policy to her. But there are other important parts. This is more of the culture. There's a narrative, a national narrative in China, according to which China historically has been very backward scientifically. And so the idea is we need to learn from the West. And of course, the idea is not that China will permanently stay backward, but that after absorbing advanced Western knowledge, then China will become a global leader in health on its own. So the Chinese were very eager to learn from the West. And because ILSI was the only entity anywhere that was willing to put money into supporting the development of obesity science in China, ILSI's science, what I've called soda science, Coca Cola science, was presented as not only the best internationally, but essentially the only science of obesity that Chinese scholars had access to.
And then what happened? Did Chinese policy did it become a policy that was advocating exercise and saying, go ahead and drink as much Coca Cola as you want and have as much junk food as you want? Or what was Chinese policy?
Yeah, it wasn't quite that striking. So ILSI China created the first two obesity policies. The first one was a set of guidelines for the management of obesity. And that was put out in 2003, before Big Food began to promote soda science, promoting activity first. That started around 2004. The second policy that ILSI was in charge of, created, is National Healthy Lifestyle for All annual campaign. They call it an action, a 行动. We can call it a campaign. And there's where you see a lot of activities focusing on on exercise for people. Starting around 2012-13, obesity was merged with a wider class of chronic diseases, and then obesity policy as a standalone policy no longer existed. But those notions about how to address obesity were built into later policies. It was never as blunt as just exercise, eat anything you want. It's just if you look really closely, you'll see that a whole host of notions that suggest a market orientation to obesity were built into policy.
So what does that mean?
For example, government had very little responsibility. Industry had little responsibility. The solution to obesity was for individuals to make lifestyle changes, and that's where soda science suggestions came in. But in many countries, industry, including foreign industry and local industry, is expected to make changes, like to lower the sugar content of their food, shrink the package size, that kind of thing.
China opposed to supersize me, which
as
we have in the
opposed
US.
to right. But now U.S. companies are really on it. They all claim now to be part of the solution. And China is very laid back. China has a market orientation to its policy. And this is
to this day, right?
To this day.
Yeah,
and this is the other aspect of what's so distinctive about China, which is one of the big policy themes that was introduced back in the late 70s in the Reform and Opening movement was marketization. 市场化, and health was one of the first sectors to be marketized. And what that means is that market solutions are market's supposed to provide the solutions for everything. And so you don't put burdens on market actors, you allow them to make money solving the problem.
Yeah. You know what's so fascinating is if you talk to other experts at Harvard who focus on health in China specifically, they really talk about very much the same issues that you're talking about. They're trying to advise the Chinese government to step back a little bit from the marketization, and they feel that China is grappling with the challenges of, it's giant hospitals that are built to simply, basically make money. And that they, it's
to get the drugs in the bodies of people, because with every drug prescribed, the income goes up.
But these are all things that they did originally study from the West. It's like they basically adopted, Western capitalist approaches, and now are sort of paying the price for that.
Right, but there's a real big difference between China and the West. I don't know if you want me to go into it now or come back to it, which is here in the West, it's a democratic system. We have nonprofits. We have critical public health scholars. We have journalists, investigative journalists. So if the state goes overboard or a company goes overboard, gets too greedy, then these people, these voices will really shout and yell and make a difference. In China, there's nobody who can critique the state. So if state policy articulates a market approach, that's the approach.
Right.
So I hope that our colleagues from the School of Public Health can influence the public health folks.
Absolutely. So is what you're describing outright corruption in terms of, what ILSI was doing and influencing the government? Or is it something more subtle than that? How do you, I'm still trying to grapple with, this infamous Miss Chen who was running ILSI in China. I mean, are we talking about, is it outright corruption, or is it something different?
This is such a critical question because the way people do ethics very different in the U.S. and in China. And in China, I would say that what they call her Professor Chen, what she did is legitimate by the terms of Chinese political culture. What she did is, I mentioned that dual role. On the one hand, she has an obligation to big food. On the other hand, she's like a government official. So she has to do right by the state and by the broad Chinese public. And so these goals can often conflict. And they did conflict. But she used particular discursive framings to make those conflicts disappear.
So what does that mean?
So for example, good question. She would say, ILSI is a scientific organization. Our policy recommendations are all very scientific. Our little BMI chart, this is very scientific. Instead of saying, this is an organization rooted in global capitalism, she'll say, this is an organization rooted in international science. And it was rooted in one international science, but not all international sciences and not the best of international science. Another thing she did is she said, We here at ILSI China, we only recommend policies. We don't make policy. Constantly the refrain of recommending. In fact, she described to me how she herself made policy, and she was very proud, of course, to have had that influence.
And are you talking about fake science, or is it not fake science? I'm
It's
still
not,
curious about these other
right.
Chinese scientists who were kind of sidelined. You know what?
They had no option but to remain silent. She was
Right.
very powerful figure.
But the people in ILSI, did they believe in their science, or did they know it was not good science?
Many people, those close, so I interviewed a very large number of Chinese scientists. Those closest to ILSI said, everything here is above board. This is good science. We're doing the same science as many in the U.S. do. But when I interviewed some very senior scientists who were probably in their 60s, 70s, they had lived through a time before money was everything.
Right.
They could see that market forces were harming, were damaging the science that they were promoting. And they were just devastated by that. But there was nothing they could do. ILSI was very powerful. There was like two government figures at its head. They couldn't challenge that.
Right. Okay. So you've written this book. You've exposed this challenge, right? And this, I guess one could really call it a problem in terms of the approach to obesity in China. So will there be any policy changes now, do you think? Or what do you see happening?
Good question.
You're laughing.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm smiling. It is the case that some policies but China's constantly reworking its health policies. Some policies, and there are other voices there. The China Nutrition Society is very different from ILSI. And ILSI, I'll tell you that in a minute.
Yeah.
The China Nutrition Society all along has been trying to encourage limits on consumption of sugary soda.
Interesting,
So
okay.
if you study policy now, you'll see that there are many provisions where citizens are discouraged from drinking too much sugary stuff. On the other hand, whether there will be serious restrictions on big food is highly unlikely. Xi Jinping himself, for the first time ever in the reform period, Xi Jinping came out and said, health is important. This is in 2016.
Okay.
He was realizing that so many Chinese, their health was being undermined by all these chronic diseases that are basically rooted in Western-style unhealthy lifestyle changes. He said, we need health in all policy, health number one. But then if you look at how that was implemented, it was a market solution to these health problems. So if you consider the case of tobacco, tobacco is a government monopoly.
Yep.
Will the state ever seriously restrict tobacco production and consumption? Everybody I talked to said no way. And so what about soda? Of course not.
Right.
And by the way, Coca Cola and one of the state-owned enterprises called COPCO, they have a partnership, a joint agreement to bottle Coca Cola in China, and their agreement covers bottling for like 80% of the population. So the state has a material incentive to not crack down too hard on Coke. And Coke and the Chinese government have so many entanglements that have developed over the years. Coca-Cola China is incredibly sophisticated. If you look at the marketing for China, you'll see they really get Chinese culture.
Wow.
It's beneficial to the company and beneficial to the state. So I'm not sure that they're going to crack down on big soda.
Right. But it's so interesting. If you look at, recent years in China, when, particularly during the Xi Jinping era, China has not been so eager to learn from the West. And so, I wonder now that change has occurred, could something like this happen again?
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
And right, so my story takes us up to about 2015. So it's the early Xi period. And I say again in the book that under Xi, things seem to be changing. But could this happen again? I think given the setup in China, namely the market is still number one. Market, again and again it came out that what matters is on a national level, economic growth, and on a corporate level, constant profit making. over human health. The priorities are absolutely clear, just like economic growth counts more than environmental sustainability.
Yeah, yeah.
But can it happen? I think it's happening now all the time, because the state it's like in bed with large companies, not only foreign companies, but Chinese companies. And it's accepted, like these soda companies, they had a place at the policy table and everybody accepted this is just normal.
Yeah.
And so, of course, they have influence on policy.
Right. It's so fascinating, though, because what you're talking about is so complex and so subtle. You know, a lot of the understanding outside of China is that Xi Jinping is kind of cracking down on the market, so to speak, right? And that there's the state is playing a larger role, et cetera. But that doesn't mean that they're moving away from the fundamental sort of profit-focused capitalist system that they have been following. Right.
And the notion that the market should solve any of these low-level human problems like health, because that's the most efficient.
Yeah,
from
and
their
it's more
point
like
of view.
it's more like it's state capitalism.
Yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
So it's not capitalism. It's more like state capitalism.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, so Xi Jinping has cracked down on the really big companies, but I don't know how many foreign firms. He's cracked down on some drug companies. I haven't heard of food companies.
So final question, what's happening with the obesity thing in China these days? Have there been any improvements, or is it still a real challenge?
No, it's still rising. There was just a path-breaking series on obesity in China published in The Lancet, a top British medical journal, a couple of years ago. 3-part series. It was really great. And in the series, some leading obesity specialists in China were railing about the impact of junk food companies on diet and in turn on weight in China. And I had hoped that they would be very supportive of this book, but the one that I've spoken to at length felt that my treatment of the head of ILSI China didn't fit with the national glorification of her role. And so once, you have this political idealism, we don't need these big food companies, and then that hits up against Guanxi relations. And who do you respect in Chinese political culture? And then sometimes stalemate results.
Well, I just want to thank you so much for sharing these thoughts. I mean, you can see from what you're describing just the incredible complexity of this book, and that you really get into everything. I mean, it's about the political system, it's about the economic system, it's about the health system, it's about the way China works and the way, the Western capitalism works as well, starting with the United States and then moving to China. And I just urge everybody to read the book. It's just absolutely fascinating.